Today we'll be looking at one of the great writers of African American literature, one of African American, the great African American writers, and one of the great American writers, Zora Neale Hurston. It's worth briefly going over her biography, which is really well laid out in the Norton, and paying attention to it. One of the key figures in sort of recognizing and thinking about Zora Neale Hurston is Alice Walker. Alice Walker, another African American novelist of a different generation. And essentially, there's a way in which we can begin to understand something about the construction of an American canon or American literary tradition around the idea that unless somebody's work has entered into academia, you're teaching it at some point or talking about it, they can be disappeared. They can sort of lose any presence and any interest because of multiple kinds of pressures. And Zora Neale Hurston had a period of about two and a half decades where she was one of the great writers. She was published well. Her books were selling very well. She published in fiction. She published nonfiction. She published autobiography, and she published numerous articles in some of the leading publications in the country. So she was extremely well known. But by 1960, when she died, she died in what was ostensibly poverty. In fact, she was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Florida, and really, essentially, disappeared from any reckoning or consideration. Her books were out of print and were not being studied until Alice Walker, as a graduate student in 1973, discovered Hurston's work. It changed her life. She became extremely interested in Hurston, orchestrated the republication of all her work, and orchestrated a critical response to it. Now, it's impossible to talk about American literature, to have an anthology of American literature, without Zora Neale Hurston being accounted for. There's a major award called the Hurston Wright Award, which is one of the major African American awards that exist in this country. And in any feminist text and any feminist consideration in America, there are two works that stand out, whether it's Zora Neale Hurston's The Eyes of Watching God or Kate Chopin's or Chopin, The Awakening. And these are two sort of interesting works because in both instances they were controversial. In both instances they were disappeared from the canon, and in both instances they reappeared in powerful and sort of unassailable ways during the period what one would call the second wave feminist period of the 1970s. So we should say a little bit more about Zora Neale Hurston. So she was born in 1891, even though for years she had been saying that she was born actually 10 years later. So Zora Neale Hurston was always 10 years older than she claimed to be. And she was born at an interesting period. I don't know how many of you may have seen the film Rosewood. It's a film that came out in the early 2000s. And it was a film about a community, based on actual historical fact, a community called Rosewood in Florida, in the state of Florida, northern Florida, a southern community that had been established by ex-slaves. It was a municipality that had been established by ex-slaves and was a very successful community. It was a community that had its own police force, its own fire brigade. It had developed its own electric system and so on and so forth. It had its mayor, and it was an entirely African American community. And in many ways, it was established to separate themselves from the segregation of Jim Crow laws and practices in the South. Rosewood was destroyed by protesters. Not, I wouldn't call them protesters, but marauding white racists who rioted, attacked Rosewood, and burnt it down, scattered everybody from that place out of jealousy, simply out of feeling that there should not be a city like this. Zora Neale Hurston's father was also a mayor of a town like that in Eatonville. A small similarly established town and municipality. And therefore, she grew up in a space in which African Americans were in leadership positions. African Americans were responsible for the running of their community and the life in their community. And I think this stayed with her for a long time because she became very convinced that there was a place, a validity. She was confident in her abilities as a black woman to be intellectual, to be able to think about things, and to contribute to the society in a very powerful way. Her childhood wasn't entirely a fun one. Her father was, notoriously unfaithful. She lost her mother when she was extremely young, and Hurston, while living in Eatonville for a while, would eventually leave. But she had a success of it. She moved to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance in the early 1900s, and became very much involved in the arts movement. She was writing for theater, for the stage. She was writing articles and stories and so on. And eventually, she would have her first novel published in about 1932. By 1939, The Eyes Were Watching God was a huge success, and she would publish several novels. Her plays were especially successful at the time, and she was part of the conversation. She was seen as a rising star. She was recognized by people like Langston Hughes and so on as somebody who was doing very important work. How did she survive? She survived. First of all, she was sponsored by benefactors. This happened to some of the blacks, including Langston Hughes. And in fact, it was the same benefactors that sponsored both Hurston and Wright. Hurston and Hughes. They essentially gave them fellowships to live and to live their life. And she worked for a woman called Hearst as a secretary, and that was a way to support her and to support her work. The difference was, of course, with Hearst, who really was obviously a philanthropist, but she also had a feeling that she wanted Hurston to do certain things, to write certain things. And so it was Hearst who got her into Barnard College, got her helped to pay for her education, and also pushed her to do work as an anthropologist and to write as an anthropologist. And some of Zora Neale Hurston's contribution to African American literature and to American literature has been primarily in the area of anthropology, writing about Black life, Black culture, and so on, which is very interesting and very telling. And one of the ways in which that has an impact for how we read her work is just how accurately she wrote in the vernacular of African Americans. She was really, really committed to speaking the voice of African Americans in the language of people living in different communities, different dialects, and so on. She had a great sound for it and a great way to capture it in writing. And we can see that in The Eyes Were Watching, in Sweat, for instance, which is really, really one of her sort of gems of a story that we'll spend some time talking about. The other thing to say about Zora Neale Hurston was that she was in debate and dialogue, often not always well accepted. She was seen as kind of strange and kind of radical in her manner. She was apparently a brilliant speaker, and she was somebody who captured the imagination of people. One of her big anthropological tasks was to travel throughout the Caribbean, where she interviewed women and she looked at the life of women and the rituals and practices of women and men in different Caribbean islands, including Barbados, Haiti, Jamaica, and so on. And so a lot of the early interesting anthropological work of the 1920s and the 1930s was done by Zora Neale Hurston in her book on African American and Black traditions, African traditions in the Caribbean, and of course in the southern states and so on. So this is a highly intelligent woman and very thoughtful woman and a great raconteur and storyteller. Hurston's life ends really in a sad way. She's first accused, completely unfounded accusations of being somehow abusive to a 10-year-old boy. And of course, the evidence is, as you'll see in the introduction, the evidence, she wasn't even in the country at the time when she was accused of this. And in fact, the case didn't go anywhere, but the story did. And the story really, really had great impact on her reputation. People, always thought, well, if it wasn't that way, then it was almost that way, and so on. Some of the evidence is there that Zora Neale Hurston ended up working as a domestic, a cleaner. She had a period where she taught some school, she did some work in different capacities, but eventually she was working as a domestic. But part of it is evidence of the impact of race in America and the ways that life was operating. Some of it was a result of the sexism in the society, and some of it was just the circumstances of her life. So that brings us to think about this wonderful story called Sweat, because of course Sweat is one of Hurston's really beautifully complex and interesting short stories. My hope is that you read it through and think about some of the themes in it. One of the things that stands out in Sweat is the way that these are the characters that are at the heart of Sweat. It's Delia, there's Sykes, there's Bertha, and then there is a cluster of people who are interesting, really, these men in the community who are observers of what is happening in the community, and who seem to be commenting on the life that Delia is experiencing with Sykes, who is unabashedly abusive towards her, and who seem unwilling to do anything about it, but to talk about it and to talk, of course, badly about it. What Zora Neale Hurston does very interestingly is position the African American woman in a circumstance, a very complex circumstance, and to watch her make her way through that circumstance to what one could argue is a liberatory moment. And the question that then arises is, how does she liberate herself? And to what extent does her story become a feminist articulation? I think there's no doubt about it that Sweat is a feminist articulation. But I think one of the ways for us to think about it as a feminist articulation is to think about agency and to think about who is responsible for her liberation, and what is the nature of this liberation. Yet inside of it, there's an interesting question that arises because, of course, while there is Delia, who is the hardworking, abused woman, believer, good woman, there's also Bertha, who is the other woman. And the other woman is sort of described in quite negative ways. She's described as very dark skinned. She's described as very fat. So there are these stereotypes that demonize her. And of course, Zora Neale Hurston doesn't allow them to be critiqued or anything like that. But she is the other woman who is having an affair with Sykes. And Sykes, of course, is somebody who is going to perpetuate his affairs and the manner in which he does so. So it's interesting. I think when you read the story, you will very quickly see the way in which Zora Neale Hurston takes us to the point where, when the story ends, we will be faced with a very interesting question, and yet we'll have somehow have been carried through to the point at which our engagement with its result, the way that the story in fact closes, will become quite interesting. I'm hoping you've read the story, because of course there's certain advantages to paying attention to it beforehand. But briefly, this is the account that I'll give of it, and then in the second part of it, we'll do some analysis of the implications of the story. So Sykes and Delia are married. They've been married for a number of years, I think 15 years that they've been married. And it begins with a very interesting description of the ways in which Sykes has been abusive to her. But the moment the story starts, it is when Delia decides to resist Sykes' abuse. And for the first time, she raises a skillet at Sykes in response to his abuse, even though we get an account that prior to that, she was never that resistant. The skillet attack on Sykes is something that startles Sykes, and he begins to think differently about Delia, but it doesn't change his behavior. So this is one of the core moments when Delia seems to have decided to take some action. However, Delia remains somebody who serves him. She's a hardworking woman. Her job has been as a washerwoman for white people. She collects laundry and she cleans that laundry, and she persists in the relationship because she doesn't want it to end, because of course she's a good Christian woman and so on. And yet she is faced with a man who is openly abusive of her, and it gets even worse when it becomes clear that he's having an affair with a woman from another town who he's brought there. He's looking after her. All the money that he doesn't work, so all the money that is being made by Delia. The house in which they live in has been bought by Delia. The horse and dray that Sykes tends to use and so on and so forth is Delia's. In other words, Delia is the breadwinner, the one who runs things, and yet she remains subservient to Sykes, and she remains willing for him to stay in her house. She doesn't throw him out. She declares at some point that she hates him, but that comes about when she realizes that he's threatening her life with the snake. And she really is determined. She doesn't say she can leave him, because of course she's not going to leave her own house. But she's at a point where she says she hates him and she doesn't have time for him. But she remains committed to the relationship in a very interesting kind of way. When we come back, we'll further our discussion about Delia and Sykes.